Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on migrating from SharePoint On-Premises to Microsoft 365. My name is Vlad Catrinescu, and I will be your host for this webinar. Before we get started with the amazing content we have planned for today, let me cover some of the more boring but important housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded and will be sent to everyone who registered within 48 hours after the event, and we encourage you to send the recording to any friend or colleague who you think might benefit from the knowledge in this webinar, and the slides will also be shared with you. We would also like to encourage you to take this opportunity to ask any questions you might have about migrating to Microsoft 365. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask all of the questions, and we'll make sure we will try to answer all of them during the call. Now enough of the boring housekeeping, let's get to the fun stuff. And first of all, I would like to introduce our amazing special guest for this webinar, Daniel Glenn, a Microsoft MVP and good friend from Nashville, or as some of you might know it, Music City. How are you doing, Daniel?
I'm doing well. That introduction sounds like I'm a great person, but I don't know if I'm going to live up to it. Hopefully I do.
Well, I mean, I have to set an expectation a bit higher. If not, they're all going to be impressed. So I want to put the pressure on you. That was the goal.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me.
So Daniel, you've been speaking at a few Microsoft Ignites. You're doing a weekly show. I know a lot of the people in the community know you, but for those of you that never heard the Daniel Glenn name before, can you do a quick introduction?
Sure thing. I would love to. And let me pull up a slide here just to kind of give you a picture. I'm sorry if that scares you there, of that picture. But yes, my name is Daniel Glenn. I am from the Nashville, Tennessee area in the United States. I have been implementing intranets for organizations for many years, more than I'd like to say, but it's well over a dozen years, and really focusing more on helping organizations get from where they are to where they want to be, whether that is lack of communication within their environment to their users, or like we're talking today, migrating from on-prem to the cloud. You can connect with me via my website, danielglenn.com, social media, the Twitter link there, YouTube, LinkedIn. You can also scan that QR code or go to danielglenn.com/hello and fill out a form, and you will automatically be emailed my contact information, so we can connect and really I can help you and understand what this journey is that you may be considering or may be on right now of migrating to the cloud. I also work for a company called InfoWorks as a Microsoft partner here based in Middle Tennessee.
Daniel, I have to ask you, and for those of you that don't know, me and Daniel have been presenting at a few sessions together, especially at SharePoint Fest. And Daniel, I just have to say your picture looks better with a mustache.
Yes, that's an inside joke, people. Vlad, don't ever present with Vlad because he will change your slides while you're presenting.
Yes, we're presenting, I think it was in Chicago together. Chicago or Seattle, I do not remember. And while Daniel was away from the computer, I just went on his About Me slide, added a big like Italian style mustache like in the video games. And then he had no idea why everybody was laughing when they got to the About Me slide.
Yes, that's a great story, Vlad. Thank you. Appreciate it. Next time I want to tell an embarrassing story about you.
Anytime.
Mm-hmm. Well, without further ado, let's just jump on in and really talk about migrating and what that's all about. So agenda is simple and short here. Hopefully not short, but simple. First, we're going to talk about why move. What is that? Why are we even considering moving? Where to move? And while this webinar is focused on Microsoft 365, there are considerations within the Microsoft 365 world of where you're going to migrate to, and we'll talk about that. And then how to move. And most people, when they think about migrations and they think, oh, how are we going to do it? They think tools. And that's most certainly, we're going to talk about that. But there's more to it than just what tool do I use to, what button do I push to make it happen? So let's jump in. Why move? Well, as you know, on-premises, you have some issues. You also have some benefits, but in the end, they could turn into issues. First of all, we have our server and SQL management. When we're dealing with SharePoint, we have to not only keep our servers up to date and patched, and you may have an automated process for that, but hopefully if you have an automated process, you have an exception for your SharePoint servers, because we don't want SharePoint installs or updates happening without a proper maintenance of SharePoint. We also have to maintain SQL and patch SQL, but also patch all the OSs that we're using on those servers. Then we have the capital expenditure of purchasing licenses for SQL, which recently changed, the licensing did, and for some made the expense of running SQL on-prem a very high one. But we also have the hardware that we have to buy and make a purchase all at once, and it does have a hit on your CapEx. Full control, so everything can be customized. This is one of those where I was talking about some benefits. It could be good for being on-prem. And in fact, most of the people that I work with, I've done many, many migrations. And most organizations that don't want to do a migration, they're in two camps. One is they want to, they think they want to keep it more secure. And they have this thought that if it's on my network, it's more secure than being in the cloud somewhere. The second is they have either customized their intranet or they want to have that control of implementing third-party applications and really make it, and this is probably people who have been in the SharePoint world have heard this, they want to make it not look like SharePoint, right? So that usually organizations are in one of those camps if they're wanting to stay on-prem. But you can also destabilize an environment very easily when you're doing implementing third-party applications. So when you have an issue with your intranet, what is causing the issue, right? Is it SharePoint? Is it system resources? Is it the database? Is it the third-party applications that you're utilizing? We do know that it's never the network problem, right? It's never a network problem. At least that's what, the network engineers tell us. And with customization comes the difficulty of upgrading every time you go to do upgrading or patching. And I've been there and done that on-prem where you get to, you patch and then you have to run the configuration wizard for SharePoint. And there's 10 steps in that configuration wizard. And you get to about step 8. And that's when you cross your fingers and you close your eyes and you say a prayer and say a wish and you throw a penny in the well, whatever you need to do to hope that you get to step 10. Because step 8 and step 9 are when most of the issues happen when you're doing patching. Network. So you have to be on network, right? When you're on-prem. So you have to have a VPN solution if you want people to access it when they're not in your office, which there's a lot of people not in the office right now. You have to manage backups, backup tapes, offsite backups. You have to pay for that offsite backup storage. Destruction of backups. A lot of people don't take that into consideration. You have to manage that process and not keep backups for prescribed, after a prescribed period of time, often for regulatory reasons or just practicality. And then practicing disaster recovery. I've been part of many disaster recovery projects where we have tested, and it's a whole weekend process, and rolling over and testing, and then usually fails in some way or form, whether it's SharePoint or some other system, and learning from that and applying what you learn and doing it all over again every 3 or 6 months. So I talked about patching and security updates for the operating system. We have downtime, and they only occasionally go down on their own, including, running out of space, for instance. You have your logs running out of space. But you also can have downtime for patching, downtime for buying new hardware and having to switch to new hardware, testing for DR and business continuity. So we have downtime on-prem, and we all know it. We all live it, those of us that are on-prem. And then permissions nightmare is what I have here. But what I'm talking about is this permissions on-prem really most often is managed by IT. So it is something where if I as a user want access to a site, I can't just get it. I can't, there is a request process in SharePoint Server to, request access, but typically it's managed by IT, and I have to wait. When I want to move that subsite that I've created, because, everyone that's on-prem has subsites, and I want to move that subsite because it was created under HR, but it really is a project. It needs to be under the project's site collection. How do I do that? It's not easy. And of course, on-prem, we have no modern features. 2019 does have some features, some new features, but it is not anywhere close to where we are with SharePoint on-prem, Online. And then end of support. So SharePoint 2010 has no mainstream support, just like SharePoint 2013. Mainstream support, what does that mean? It's product being worked on by Microsoft to bring new features or integrate with other software. Issues arising from bugs are free to fix with support, so you can call in and get those, get help from Microsoft for free in mainstream support. Extended support, no new features, and support has to be paid for in one way or another. So 2010, it was recently extended for the extended support to be in April of next year. 2013 is in a couple years. That it'll come fast. But also SharePoint 2016, the mainstream support ends next year, next summer, less than a year away, the mainstream support. So support will then have to be paid for 2016. So it's quickly happening. All right, where do we move? So for moving off-prem SharePoint, if that's the correct direction for your organization, then the next question is going to be where to move. Well, of course, this webinar is about Microsoft 365. So when we move to Microsoft 365, we get, of course, Microsoft Search, which is great for getting access to your content no matter where it is within the tenant, whether that's in SharePoint and OneDrive. I mean, wherever it is, where Microsoft Search is the place to go to find it. Of course, we get all the versions. We have versioning on SharePoint Server on-prem, yes. However, online, we have so much storage that a lot of organizations are extending their versions that they're keeping on their documents so that they can really go back to where they need to get access to that content. And the editing experience is wonderful compared to what it is on-prem, even if you have Office Online Server installed on-prem. Access Anywhere is my way of saying no VPN. I'm not saying you can get rid of your VPN. There may be other things you need on-prem, but VPN is one of those things that I think a lot of users really dislike tremendously. However, they have to put up with it. but getting access not only without a VPN, but also on my mobile device, my tablet, and getting secure access wherever I am so that I can get to my files, get to my email, get to the collaboration that's happening is a huge benefit. And then, of course, metadata is something that Microsoft is improving online. We're seeing improvements happening with managed metadata, as well as improvements on things like recently in the last, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks, we now have a picture metadata for lists, which is fantastic. We have more space for and to extend our recycle bin storage. We have data center redundancy. This is so that if, for instance, Microsoft's data center goes down or is wiped out by a hurricane, then our data still lives. And so that DR type of scenario is taken care of for us. And then when permissions, I talked about permissions being driven by IT before. Permissions are driven by users, can be in Microsoft 365. Of course, IT can control that if that's your governance policy, but we can allow users to be admins of groups, and they can manage those memberships pretty easily. I'm going to pause for 1 second just to say I do have a link, a short code link at the bottom of my slides, most of my slides here. It's the same link, and that'll take you to my blog post about this webinar, where I will be posting the materials for the webinar. So if you'd like the material, slides and the recording, you can go to that short link. So you can just write that down right now, and that'll help you get to the information later. Sorry, I didn't mention that earlier. Okay, so we're going to move to Microsoft 365. So once you make that decision, then the decision needs to be made, where is the content going? This decision will be influenced, of course, by what services you will use in your Microsoft 365 tenant. If your organization will focus communications and document management in SharePoint, then mapping out the move from SharePoint will be pretty straightforward from SharePoint Online, for SharePoint On-Prem, sorry. But some organizations will utilize Microsoft Teams more heavily and want to give their users the easiest access to content that way. There are also organizations that are looking at Teams as a way of replacing or heavily augmenting their intranet. So when you're migrating your content from on-prem to Microsoft Teams, you need to know how your users will be utilizing the platform. Will you need a heavy integration of an intranet? Or I'm working with a client right now where they're doing, yes, they have an intranet, but they're doing Teams first, meaning they are having their users work and collaborate in Teams. That's a natural place for them to be. And they're accessing their files that way. So you have to be mindful of how you move that content. By now, you probably know that Microsoft Teams uses SharePoint Online for file storage. OneDrive is used, OneDrive for Business is used for file storage and those chats that you have, those one-on-one chats or one-to-group chats. However, from a SharePoint perspective, there's a lot of change that comes into play when you're going to make Teams the centralized communication platform for your organization. One example. Most SharePoint architects will tell you to stay away from using folders within libraries. Folders have a way of hiding content and not bringing it to the surface the way that you would like to see it in SharePoint. So you use metadata for that, not folders. However, Microsoft Teams immediately creates folders within your SharePoint library. So it is, if you're going to use Teams, you can't get away from folders. It's impossible. So what do you do? So you have to keep that in mind when you're going to do your migration, if Teams is going to be a central platform you're going to use. So you get a general folder in your SharePoint document library for every team you create, and that team uses that shared documents library and creates a general folder for the general channel. You have to put files in there for them to show up by default in the Files tab in Teams. Private channels. Private channels files are kept in SharePoint as well, but it's in a different site collection actually. So it's not just one site you're going to be dealing with per Microsoft team if you are utilizing private channels, for instance, or the different types of channels other than general. Then you have to worry about file access for non-team members. This is something I'm going through right now with a client, is how do I set up my team? So let's say we have team A, team B, team C, and I have a subgroup of team C. So not even the whole team C, but a subgroup of team C that needs access to some of the files in team A. So how do we do that? They're not part of team A. So how do we work that system? And we're not going to utilize private channels because we want it to be all team A needs to see it. So it is complicated, and it's not something that you can just go, oh, we'll just move it into one folder and we're done. And then the Microsoft List app, recently announced as part of the Microsoft List initiative, brings in that rich list experience. So we're migrating content from our SharePoint On-Prem lists into SharePoint Online list. Well, we can utilize that in Teams now. It's going to be fantastic to bring the wonderful formatting and such of Microsoft Lists in our team in a tab, and it's going to be really a great experience so that it can help augment or maybe replace your intranet. Let's go back to that slide about which service. I just want you to highlight that SharePoint powers files in Microsoft 365. All files you store in Yammer are now in the new Yammer are now in Microsoft 365 Groups SharePoint site. All files you store in your team, just as we're talking about in Microsoft Teams, is in the Microsoft SharePoint 365 Groups SharePoint site. So when we're talking about migrating SharePoint content to the cloud, there's other services that come into play. And how are those services going to consume the content that we're migrating? And then last thing I'll talk about on where to move is organization matters. So what I mean by organization is, if you're in SharePoint, you know this. You have some people typically organize their sites in departments or business units, kind of silos of organizational chart, or they do it by functional areas, or a mixture of both. So when you're moving from on-prem to cloud, you have to keep in mind, how am I going to translate that to the cloud? When SharePoint Online, we're really discouraging people from using subsites. So you've got to look at every site you have and determine, how can I migrate this site and get it to the cloud, but not be a subsite if it's a subsite already. If I have a project hub with a bunch of subsites that are projects, how am I going to migrate that to the cloud? And then, do you need to do a reorg of your working groups or how your teams are organized in SharePoint sites? Do you need to work around, and this is a perfect time to do it. I talked earlier about how it's complicated to move sites around sometimes on-prem. Well, you're going to be moving to the cloud, so now's the time to be thinking about that. And don't forget about your project sites. Now, this could be, yes, Microsoft Project Server. That's, Project Server uses SharePoint as its underlying technology, so it could be Project Server sites, but this is also could be just, project template sites that are in SharePoint. And I talked about, Project Hub. You could also have regional hubs or functional hubs like HR Hub. For a large organization, you may have HR in different countries, but you want to have one central HR hub, or IT, for instance. Well, we need to learn about SharePoint hubs and how we organize our content. The hubs come into play. Home sites. What home sites give us is that central place, the authority of news for our organization. So how are we going to use home sites our home site to really bring in the content in one central place? So normally that's your, your landing page for your intranet, but how are we going to use that? And then are we going to use our root site? Most people don't know before, for the longest time, when you created a Microsoft 365 tenant, you got automatically a SharePoint site at your root. So if your tenant name is Daniel, let's say, then you would get a site at daniel.sharepoint.com. And that site was a classic site. But now we have the capabilities to swap that root site with another site. So you can create a site, a communications site that's, a beautiful intranet for your organization, and you can swap that. Well, that needs to be part of this conversation about your migration of where you're going to move content, and then how are you going to make it the centralized area for your organization.
Hey,
Okay.
Daniel,
Yes.
as you move over to the next one,
Yes.
one quick question as you talk about organizing content.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, so if you go to Microsoft Teams with all of those folders, do you still need to create content types?
Mm-hmm.
Or is the concept of the content type back to folders? And I know we can argue for days, but what do you... how do you see this change back to the folder? Should people still look at content types, metadata, and all of this?
Yeah. My short answer is yes. Content types are not gone. They are not something that you should stop using. Yes, Teams utilizes folders, but it doesn't have to utilize, and it doesn't utilize multiple folders within each channel. So each channel gets a folder, but then inside that, you're going to have all your documents for that channel. So even when you're using Teams, content types are going to come into play. Microsoft is bringing a richer files experience into Teams. So that will be soon, you'll be seeing a lot of more improvements there. So content types definitely play into how you're going to manage the files that you bring in. And also remember, Teams, even if it is a central technology, it's a central tool for your organization, it is not the only one. And most likely, and what I'm seeing is people utilizing Teams, but they still have that intranet, a place to publish news, a place to get links for everyone. And you just don't get that with Teams. And so you still have an intranet where you're going to have centralized documents where, if you're going to do that in Teams, you would have to do some Teams templates and yada, yada, yada. And it still would not be, in my opinion, maintainable when you want to add a new link. Or add a new tab, so you're going to have an intranet. And on that intranet, you're going to have content types. So it is most certainly something that is not going away. Thank you for that question.
Awesome. And the other one, which is more of a remark, but something that you can maybe comment on, is from Daniel. I guess a big headache is migrating on-premises 2010 and 2013 workflows to Power Automate or Nintex or another third party without bankrupting the company.
Yeah, and I do have a comment on workflows coming up, so I will address that a little bit. But
awesome.
It depends on how big your company is, whether we can bankrupt it or not. But that's a joke. That's a joke. So let me get to that workflow, and I'll talk a little bit about how the process for workflow works. But what the question is alluding to, and is correct, is there's no magic button. So, but let me get to there, okay? I will answer that one.
Sounds good.
Okay. So how to move, and I kind of broke this down to 3 areas: process, tools, and who does the work. Okay. So process. First up, we do assessment. You need to do an assessment of what you're moving to, moving out of. Just like when you're going to move from one home to another, you take inventory of what you have now, so you know where it is going to go in the new home, right? So this is what the assessment is. You'll perform a data cleanup or move everything. Do you clean up them before the migration, or do you clean it up after you've already migrated it? There's a lot of considerations here on how fast do you need to do this? When are you going to kick it off? What kind of risks are you taking on? What is the cost of the project? And do you have compliance or regulation issues when you're dealing with your data cleanup? And then you have custom solutions that are in your organization. So these are web parts that you may have installed. They may be free. They may be from Microsoft or other third parties, but you may have paid for these. I think Nintex was a question that was asked about. Maybe you have Nintex integrated with your on-prem, but there's a lot of solutions that you could have been installed over time, and you may not even know about. If you've inherited an environment, you may not even know all the solutions that are out there. So you need an inventory of those. Now, workflows. The question about workflows. First of all, I want to make sure everyone knows that SharePoint 2010 workflows are being retired in SharePoint Online. So if you have SharePoint 2010 workflows that you're wanting to migrate, you're going to need to redo those. Okay, so wait a minute, Daniel, I'm on SharePoint 2013. What does SharePoint 2010 have to do with this? There are two workflow engines in SharePoint, 2010 and 2013, okay? And the SharePoint 2010 workflows are some of the most utilized types of workflows, and the built-in workflows for gathering feedback and approvals, those built-in workflows are actually SharePoint 2010 workflows. So if you're utilizing those for page approvals or document approvals, then they're not going to work in SharePoint Online. Now, this is a problem. And for people who are going to be in SharePoint Online, how do we deal with that? And it is a very valid question of how the path is to utilize, the Microsoft path is to utilize Power Automate to replicate those workflows. But how do you do that without spending all your time on workflows? It's a very good question, and there's no magic pill. There's no easy button. There's no way around it. So your assessment, you can do a scan of your environment to see how many workflows you have, and then you're going to have to go through each one of those workflows and work with the users. Is this workflow being used? You can see when it was last run, but you need to work with people to see when it was last used, or if it's needed. And there's no way around it. So I talk about a little bit about who does the work. I talk about partnering with, like a Microsoft partner, such as myself, to help you do that. Where we can bring our expertise and make it go faster. But still, there's no way around it. You're going to have to do it. Now, personally, I think a lot of your workflows, I think a majority of workflows that are there are probably not being used. That's what I'm seeing with my clients. But the ones that are usually typically just small workflows that can be easily replicated with a template in Power Automate, meaning in the library, you just say automate and you click this, and there's flow templates, and you can pick one and easily get going with that workflow. So, replicating a workflow can take, an hour. So no way around it. Work with someone who's done it before. Permissions. Most on-prem SharePoint environments have a hybrid permissions policy, meaning they utilize AD security groups when they can, but adding individual users to SharePoint groups when required. So some evaluation is needed to understand where permissions need to be corrected or cleaned up. Content owners and leads for your organization divisions or groups play a crucial role in this process. And then what will you do with Access Web Apps and other unsupported functions? Access Web Apps is a way for those on-prem for you to publish a Microsoft Access database as a web site so that users can interact all at the same time on Access. Well, that's not supported in SharePoint Online anymore. They turned that off a while ago. So if you have those, what are you going to do with the content? Are you going to map it to just a regular SharePoint site, or are you going to not use it anymore? Do you need a custom application created? So when you do that evaluation, that's something you do need to worry about. There are many business processes that you don't know about. Whether you're a business person or you're an IT person, there's going to be processes that you really don't know about. So when considering your environment, take special note of the ones you do know about, and then do a survey of your users about their processes. You're going to have to work. It is not, again, there's not an easy way around this. You're going to need to work with your users to find out what are the processes they're doing with your sites in SharePoint Online, so that you make sure you don't completely ruin that when you get the migration done. Use this also as an opportunity to identify superheroes in your organization. Right now, they will help you identify processes, but tomorrow, when you have sites to manage in SharePoint Online, they will be the ones to help you manage that content, police other users, and help train their coworkers. Main points here is in the assessment. Where is it? Is it SharePoint, file share, etc.? What is it? Types of content, processes that are behind it, what workflows, who owns it and has access to it. So it's not only who owns it, that process, and can make decisions about it, but who has access, who can read, who can write. We need to know those. We need to have answers to those for our sites. And if you've got a lot of sites, a lot of processes, it'll take a while. It is not unheard of for the assessment phase of a migration project to take up a large portion of your project plan. Because if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And then we got to make a decision. Are we going to go big bang or one at a time? Meaning, for the big one, the big migration approach, you inventory all your content, work with content owners, and then you do a migration, like one big one, and then test. Department by department can be slower from an overall project perspective because you might pause after a migration of a department site or groups of sites and take what you've learned and apply it to the next migration. It also can be a little problematic with making sure people know where to go to get content. So some sites will still be on-prem while others are in SharePoint Online. So you need to update navigation between the two. And that's the easiest way to make sure that people know where to go. So when you look at your process, you need to take into account the facts you found when you did the assessment in your environment and marry that with your organization's ability to withstand change, to come up with that plan. And don't forget to hold workshops. What I mean by workshops is really the conversation that the project team has with users to help them know what's going on, but also to learn from them. What is it they are doing and how best to approach the migration? Do we do it all at once so that search works and we don't have to do hybrid search, and we have we don't have to worry about navigation. We just move everything at once, or do we do one department or one group of sites at a time? And then perform trials. Remember, migrations can be repeated. So test to make sure it looks and performs functionally the way you want it to. Don't ever do a migration without tests. We can do a migration, whether you're using a Microsoft tool or a third-party tool. You can utilize, do a migration and then do incremental migration to say, okay, I did a migration on day 1, on day 50, day 5, whatever it is, we say we'll do an incremental to catch all of the updates that have happened since day 1. So we can do those whenever we need to. You can do them as many as you need to, those incrementals. So, which is great about migration, because you can keep everybody working on-prem while you get online ready. But make sure you involve your users in these trials. Don't migrate content as a trial and go, oh yeah, it looks good, so we're good to go, without involving your users. All right, so that is process. Let's look at tools. So mention mover.io. This is a application and website that Microsoft bought. The sources there are run the gamut of online sources and on-prem sources, but now is not the tool to utilize for SharePoint on-prem. So I mention it here just to say mover.io is something that a lot of organizations have used in the past, but Microsoft does not want you using it for SharePoint on-prem, and I'll tell you what you're going to be using for SharePoint on-prem. But destinations, we have a plethora of destinations for Mover within the Microsoft stack. What you should be using for SharePoint on-prem is the SharePoint migration tool, shortcut as SPMT. We can go from SharePoint, or we can go to SharePoint Online, Microsoft Teams, and OneDrive from SharePoint 2010, 13, 16, file shares, and local drives. We do have that, I talked about doing an assessment. We have a migration assessment tool, which is a command line tool to know if really your farm is going to have issues with the migration with the SPMT tool. And so definitely you're going to run that assessment tool to understand, to begin your project, to say, okay, where are we? What is happening? So that we can get a good idea. So the migration tool is GUI based. So it is something that you can utilize and not have to know, command line. I'm going to talk about how you can use command line here in a second. You can migrate those lists, libraries, file shares, as I mentioned, and complete sites. It does include a PowerShell module, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. We can create migration job CSVs to do multiple sites at once, which is awesome. And of course, it's a recommended method by Microsoft. But remember, it only supports SharePoint and file shares and local drives as well on the server that you're running it on. We select, it has this, I talked about we can do a full, but then we can do incremental, which is fabulous. We migrate those files pretty easily within it. And then we can also create input files to be able to consume that information. So we can, when we're talking about a major migration, we can really set it up so we're not having to click 10 times for every site that we're going to move. We can migrate into an existing site or library. If you're doing file shares or local files, you can only go to existing sites, but if you're doing SharePoint migrations, it does not need to exist already. You can add multiple tasks in a single migration, which is nice. You can set them all up. And I'll tell you the best time to do this is after hours because of resource throttling that Microsoft has in place so people have access to their content during the workday of their local region. So the best time is to do it after hours. So you can queue these up and then hit go for when you're wanting to migrate. You can save your configuration in a JSON file within the GUI. So this is not something you have to know how to use JSON or formatting. You can save it and reuse it, and that's great for incrementals. I can't tell you how much I love incrementals, and the SharePoint migration tool helps you do those pretty easily. I mentioned command line. So we do have a PowerShell module. It's the migration tool .PowerShell, and there's just a short link to the documentation. So if you go to danielglenn.com/B43K, it directly links you to the Microsoft information on that module. So how to use it, and gives you some resources as well as some samples. You can also use export-spweb And I've got a short link there, danielglenn.com/pt47 to Vlad's course. He does a good job at talking about that on how to do PowerShell migrations. And then, of course, I have to mention third-party applications because they do play a role. You can do migrations with just the Microsoft free tool, the SharePoint migration tool. You can do your full migration that way. But if you want some more flexibility with your migration, supporting maybe an older version that the SharePoint migration tool doesn't support, do metadata mapping beforehand or user mapping. User mapping is a little better in third-party applications, while the SharePoint migration tool does have some user mapping, custom user mapping that you can use. The third-party applications can do a better analysis of your site and give you a graphical and really a great way of understanding what's going on in your sites, and do have improved reporting. So these tools come from organizations like ShareGate and Metalogix and AvePoint and others. And then I put this in here, and I almost hesitated. I did hesitate. I almost didn't include it, but you can do a manual move. So what does manual move mean? That's users or admins are responsible for manually copying over data. It really should only be used in limited cases. I mean, if you're a small organization and you really don't have a lot of content, maybe you just have a handful of users, then maybe manual is the way to go. But remember, with manual, you get no versions. If you're coming from SharePoint to SharePoint, you're not going to get versions when you're manually dragging and dropping. You're not going to get permissions carrying over. So you can drag and drop kind of experience from manual migrations, or you can use the OneDrive sync client to, sync the content from your machine. Again, I don't recommend it for any sort of enterprise scale, but it actually could be used on a smaller part of your migration. In fact, I just completed a migration for a healthcare organization, and they really wanted to empower their users to move their personal files. And so we migrated their content for their enterprise files into SharePoint and OneDrive when it made sense. But then they used their OneDrive sync client on each machine, and people just basically were educated. We told them and showed them how to do it, to filter out the content they don't need anymore and then move the content they do need into their OneDrive sync folder, and it just synced over time. So it is a way you could manually do it and be part, and it just work out for your organization. So don't think that it's not, it doesn't have to be part of, it can be part of what you're trying to do. All right, that's my tools. And then let me quickly talk about who does the work. So I kind of, here's some, every migration project doesn't have to have every one of these roles, but we have a migration lead. So they're responsible for the whole team, project tasks, scheduling meetings and such. An information architect, which is really the person who would lay out how content is going to get moved and where. Again, are we utilizing Teams and SharePoint? How does that mix all work? Yammer. We have sign owners. Remember to include those people who manage the content, own the content in the process. You have migration experts, whether this is a Microsoft partner you bring in, like myself, or it is a person that is taking on that task internally. Someone who handles communications for your organization. So we got to make sure that we're communicating with our users. We need technical trainers, someone who, one or more people who can really provide that training on the tools for when we get moved. And then, of course, support needs to be involved so that not only they know when it's happening, but how to support users when it does happen. And then, of course, adoption expert, someone who is, again, this could be internal, external, but someone who can help. And this is more than training. Adoption is something is really needed when you're doing this migration. It goes without saying, really, but Microsoft 365 is not like anything you have on-prem. Yes, you have SharePoint on-prem, maybe, okay, fine. SharePoint Online is where you're going with that. Okay, so it may be a similar experience, but there's so much more available in SharePoint Online versus what you have on-prem in regards to features, and differences in abilities and how you do things. So helping your users really immerse themselves in the technology is going to be very important. Adoption is not just training. A lot of organizations fail their migrations, not because they don't get the files moved, but because their users are not ready for the technology, a new way of doing things, and adapting to new processes. If you don't do your due diligence and you're only providing training, but not enabling your users and having that adoption program, then you're really going to fail in the long run. You'll ultimately fail your migration. Microsoft recently announced the adoption site. So go to adoption.microsoft.com. That's a great resource to get started in learning about adoption. I talked about training. Yes, admins are going to need training on not only how to use the service, but the differences and how to manage it. And then Microsoft 365 groups, what does that mean? How is that going to play into your organization? Training for users, of course, on SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, what to use when. That's a huge question that organizations have to answer for themselves of how you do work. Governance really defines who does what when. That's my best layman's terms of what governance is. It needs to integrate with what your organization needs. You also need to get buy-in for users. They need to know what they're getting out of this as part of what are these rules and these processes defining governance. What do I get out of it? What are the benefits? And then remember, governance changes over time. This is a living, breathing process, a document or documents. And so we have to remember that it's not just a stale document. All right. And then I'm getting to the end here. So I want you to remember a partner can help you achieve more. They enable better and faster projects. And we come with experience from the many migrations over the many years that we've been doing this. So obviously you want to have someone who's an expert in SharePoint. And like InfoWorks, we are a employee-owned company. So we are heavily invested in your project's success because it is something that heavily plays into our company's success. And as a company owner, I care not only about my company, but about yours. So you can learn more about my company at infoworks-tn.com, where we are based in Middle Tennessee, but we service our clients worldwide. Keeping up with change in Microsoft 365. Yes, remember on-prem, we have this ability to stop change, right? Because we don't have to push in updates. But in Microsoft 365, changes come every week. You need a process for understanding what's there, what's coming, and how you communicate that to your users. One of those resources is, and Vlad mentioned this at the top of the webinar, I do a show every week talking about the announcements and what's coming to your tenant in Microsoft 365. So we do it live on YouTube, and we broadcast now through Twitter, Periscope, and Facebook, but you can also get audio recording. We have a large portion of our audience, actually a majority of our audience, is getting it through the podcast app of their choice. We're everywhere on all the podcasting platforms. You can get those links at messagecenter.show, and that has all the details on the show. All right, key takeaways. This is my last slide, and then we're going to jump into some questions with the time remaining.
Like 5 or 6 of them, so we're good.
So key takeaways. Know your content. Do a proper assessment. Take the time to do it right, okay? And like I said at the beginning when I was talking about assessment, it will be a good portion of your project. Don't think I'm going to take 1/10 of my project time to do assessment. That is not how it works in real life, okay? So take a realistic approach to this. Know where you're going. And there's kind of a couple parts to this. One is know what success looks like for your organization. Plan what the destination is. What does it look like? And what is that success criteria? And then the second part is, what services will you use and how will you map your content to it? Then for tools, develop a project plan that takes into account not only where you are going, but how you're going to get there. Know what tools you will use and how you will engage with your employees. Work with a partner. Working with a partner will take your project, will make your project 72% more successful. Don't wait to get an expert who has performed many successful migrations before. Do it now. Do it at the beginning of your project. And don't forget, you need to facilitate a sustainable adoption program for long-term success. I'm going to leave this slide up so you can scan that QR code, go to the URL, connect with me on socials, and then remember that bottom link is where you can get resources once we have those posted. So let's talk about questions that people have.
Awesome. So let me take the first one from Kevin. How do we migrate performance point objects such as scorecards and dashboards? Is it a throwaway and redo in Power BI, or is there a way to migrate them?
Yeah, great question about performance point. It is not something that's in SharePoint Online, so it is a redo. Power BI is the way to go to that. You could also do some, depending on the type of dashboard and the data source, you could do some easy type of BI that doesn't involve Power BI with just SharePoint charts that are available, but Power BI is your resource.
So, okay, next one from Geraldine. Hi, what happens to documents versioning and history when migrating?
Yeah, so if you're using a migration tool such as Microsoft's free product or a third party, versions that you have in SharePoint, you can choose to keep versions when you're moving from SharePoint On-Prem to SharePoint Online, as well as permissions. So there will be a setting in those tools to say, I want to keep versions and how many versions I want to keep, as well as if you want to keep permissions.
Awesome. Okay, next one from Marcos. What about the Record Center template that was used on-prem? It's available online, but it's not modern. Should we really be used for large amount of scattered files?
I believe there is going to be some love given to records in SharePoint Online. I know there has been already, and there will be soon more innovation that's happening with that. But you're right, the current template in SharePoint Online is not modern. And if you're utilizing Record Center on-prem heavily, then that is the destination you're going to go to in SharePoint Online with that Record Center template. However, if you're not using it heavily, I would say then take a look at some of the records and compliance types of functionality that doesn't involve that template in SharePoint Online.
And also, as a bit of a promotion for one of the webinars we actually have coming on August 25th, it's called Modernize Records Management in a New World of Remote Work with Microsoft 365. And we're actually going to have Roberto Iglesias and Tina Ng from Microsoft. And that webinar will really be about records management. You will get a link to it when you get the recording in about 48 hours, but if you're interested in records management, that might be a very interesting one to sign up for.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now let's take a question from Robin. What do you do with the sites that you do not migrate?
Yeah, for sites that you do not migrate, there's obviously been a decision why you're not migrating those. So you might keep them as on-prem for maybe so you would do a hybrid environment where whatever site you're not migrating, you would keep on-prem. If you don't need them on-prem, then I would take a good backup of that server. And then if you're kind of decommissioning the server, take a great backup of the server, whether it's a virtual machine or hardware, and then decommission. But document why those sites are not being migrated and how you can get access to them. I would leave the server up and running for a few months if you can, just in case someone says, hey, what about this site that I use every blue moon I forgot about? So you can go ahead and migrate that afterwards if you need to.
Yeah, what I've usually seen, Daniel, is let's say you leave the server up and running, but you either cut it down at the DNS level or maybe
yes.
shut down IIS, so it's still not accessible, right?
That's right. Yeah. You don't let users touch it, don't get to it. But if they say, hey, I do need to get that to content, then you can then migrate it for them. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, question from Edwin. Is there a Microsoft 365 sync client for on-site file server folder migration?
So the sync client that you can utilize if you want a ongoing syncing, you can utilize the OneDrive sync tool to do that. Of course, though, that is a user-focused tool. The SharePoint migration tool is one that can run and migrate content as well from a job kind of thing. If you're looking for an ongoing just syncing, neither one of those will be it. You might want to look at a third-party kind of product, but again, you can use the OneDrive sync tool, but that's user-focused. Meaning the user has to be logged in.
I think, like you said, there's no real sync client, but with the migration tool and the PowerShell commandlets, you can do a scheduled job that would kind of be like a sync client. But again, we're getting creative here.
Yes, that's right.
We're getting very creative.
Hire a partner to do that for you.
Okay, so now I actually have two questions, one from Suresh and one from Anita, that have to do with InfoPath forms.
Yep.
What should we do when we want to migrate InfoPath forms to SharePoint Online?
Yeah, InfoPath forms, along with SharePoint Designer workflows, are one of those that we have to take in consideration of what are we going to do with them. InfoPath forms are supported in SharePoint Online for now, but don't expect that support to last too long. So do we keep them? Do we get rid of them? I say get rid of them and replicate them, whether that is with a SharePoint Online lists form. So when you're doing a new item or editing, those are pretty nice. Now, do we have the capability of hiding those? Not at this moment. So do we, if it's just a simple, I want to hide one form, one field, then we don't have that at this moment. But Power Apps is the way to go with that. You can simply create a Power App that's based on a SharePoint list. It gives you those forms. It takes about 5 minutes to edit that form, remove that field from the form, and then publish it. And now you have a form without that, that column that you were trying to hide from input. That's one of the most easiest ways to do it. But Power Apps is the way to go with that. Or you can use Microsoft Forms. If really you created a kind of a survey in InfoPath, you can use Microsoft Forms for that as well.
So, okay, one last question.
Okay.
Is managed metadata still supported in Office 365?
Yes, absolutely. Managed metadata is still supported in Office 365. So utilizing, and they're improving the managed metadata service as well, modernizing it. So it is definitely supported and definitely has a future in SharePoint Online.
Awesome. And yes, we actually recently did a webinar with Sean Squires from Microsoft on the new experiences of managed metadata service. I'll put that link in the chat right away, but it's definitely something they're investing in, especially as with Project Cortex as well, which is a whole other topic, but being able to tag and find relevant information is super important. Well, this is it, Daniel. We're 5-6 minutes past the time, so thank you very much for taking all of those questions. Thank you for everybody who attended the webinar. I really hope that you found it informative. And again, a final thanks to Daniel for taking the time out of your busy day to share your knowledge with the community. It's really appreciated.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone for being here.
Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.